Hey everyone, today is October 10th, and this edition of Mastadon's Bookshelf brings you the story Faerie Ring. Thomas looked out the window as he idly sat at his desk in his bedroom. He'd slept poorly the night before and had woken early. The sun was rising rapidly as night quickly turned into day. As the sun peaked higher and higher over the mountains, shadows retreated across the yard. The yard was large. Their house was built on a property that spanned nearly 2 acres. Towards the back of the yard grew a bunch of apple trees. In the growing light, their shadows disappeared, leaving dew-covered grass in their wake. It had rained the previous night, leaving puddles dotting the yard. They had a garden at one side of the yard, and the rain had left some of the bare dirt muddy. A ring of mushrooms had sprung up around a muddy patch overnight, a fairy ring. He watched the ring of mushrooms intently. He swore he could have seen something move there. Tom shook his head and laughed at himself for having such foolish thoughts. He'd probably just seen a cat hunting mice, or maybe it was just the shadows moving as the sun rose higher. After having slept so poorly, he must have been a little jumpy. He had nightmares all night, and they had left him skittish. It was odd, though, because he couldn't remember what any of them were about. He just felt uneasy. It was approaching evening when Tom went out into the backyard, sent out to get some potatoes from the garden for dinner. He went into the shop, first needing to get a shovel, and then headed towards the garden. The sun was beginning its descent towards the horizon after it had lazily traversed the sky all day. Autumn had finally arrived, and the days were beginning to get noticeably shorter. He walked over to the garden, dragging the blade of the shovel along the grass. The ring of mushrooms was still there. Of course, there was no reason it shouldn't have been. He looked down at the mushrooms. They were a white-gray color with flat, droopy tops. He thought it was weird because the dirt in the middle of the ring was still muddy, even though it had been a nice day. He shrugged and dug up a few potatoes to bring in for dinner. While he dug up the potatoes and washed them, he kept looking back towards the ring of mushrooms. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. After dinner, Tom sat at his desk again. He had his biology textbook and was trying to study for a test he had later in the week, but he couldn't focus. He still felt unnerved from the nightmares he had had the night before. He looked out the window, and the sun was just about to disappear behind the mountains. The apple trees at the end of the yard had long, twisting shadows that looked like hands reaching out towards him, waiting to grab at him. He sighed and closed the textbook. Even though he'd just started studying, he wasn't going to get anything productive done right now. He was too distractible. He grabbed a sketchbook from the floor beside his desk and flipped it open to a blank page. Tom hoped that he could try and sketch whatever was bothering him out of his system. Maybe he couldn't recall consciously what he had dreamt about, but if he put a pencil to paper, maybe his hand could pull it out of his head without him needing to think of it. He had barely even sketched 2 lines onto the paper before his attention was drawn out the window. He could have sworn that he had something moving out of the corner of his eye, but there was nothing that he could see. Why was he so jumpy? Tom looked out the window for a minute more, but couldn't see anything. The sun fell behind the mountains, giving them the appearance that they were on fire. The apple trees' long, creeping shadows disappeared into the shadows of twilight. He turned his attention back to his sketchbook and continued drawing. Again, he'd been sketching for less than a minute, and something caught his attention at the window. Still, there was nothing. He sighed in frustration and put down his pencil. "Why can't I concentrate?" he asked no one in particular. This time he did see something move outside. He couldn't say what it was, because as far as he could tell there was nothing there. Nonetheless, he would have sworn he saw something move by the fairy ring. He stared at it. Was there a cat there? No, there couldn't be. It wasn't so dark that he couldn't see a cat. Maybe a mouse? Neither of those ideas made sense, because there wasn't anything there that an animal could hide in. Again, he saw something move. It was like the ground itself had moved. A gob of mud had jumped or splattered or something. It didn't make any sense, but now Tom was intrigued, and he leaned towards the window trying to get a better look at the ring of mushrooms and the mud that lay in their center. A glob of mud lifted up into the air as if someone had scooped up a handful. Hung suspended in the air, and Tom felt a silent, "no way," hanging in his throat, as if echoing the motion of the mud. There had to be something out there. Tom got up from his desk and ran downstairs. He stepped outside and looked toward the garden and where the fairy ring would be. The lump of mud still hung in the air, but it seemed to have gotten bigger, though maybe it just looked bigger because he was closer now. No, it looked like it was getting larger, almost like it was being spread over something. As he watched, he was certain that the mud was being spread over something. He could begin to make out features. That was what he assumed to be a head, and then the mud was being spread down over the neck. Yes, now it was being spread over shoulders. Tom had never seen anything like this. He wondered what it could possibly be. Before he realized what he was doing, he was walking closer. It had started to get cold outside, now that the sun had nearly set, but Tom didn't notice as he walked closer to the garden. It was like he was entranced by what he was seeing. It didn't make any sense at all. The invisible thing had spread mud down its arms now, and started to spread mud down along its chest. It was slight and thin-framed, though it was taller than Tom was. He was more than intrigued now as he watched the thing add more and more mud to its frame, which was becoming identifiable as being male. Idly the thought of if he was or was not dreaming passed through his head, but he dismissed it. He knew he wasn't dreaming. His fingers itched to reach out and touch it as he watched mud glide over the planes of its back and down towards its buttocks. Finally it covered its legs, encasing itself in a shell of mud. Tom's hand was stretched halfway towards it, wanting to touch it, but hesitant to do so. Now that the thing was covered completely in mud, it had stopped moving, a statue in the middle of the Faerie Ring. Tom swallowed, and stretched his hand the rest of the way, touching the mud. It was soft and warm beneath his fingers, yet firm at the same time. He placed his hand against his chest, feeling the warmth from beneath seep into his cold hands. He hadn't noticed how cold it had become outside. It was now more night than twilight, with the first stars appearing in the dark sky above. Lights turned on in the house behind as Tom's parents went about their business, but they didn't look outside and see their son or the mud statue. A cold, fluorescent glow flickered in the house's windows, but it didn't reach as far out into the yard as where Tom stood. He stood there with his hand on the statue. It might have been moments, or it could have been hours that Tom stood there, but he couldn't have said how long it was. From around his hand the mud began to crack. He watched as the line spread outwards and around the edges of its torso, up its throat and across its face. The feeling of the mud beneath his hand never changed. It still felt warm, soft, and supple. The mud began to flake and fall away, revealing pale white skin beneath. Tom looked up into the eyes of a young man who now stood in front of him, and then quickly looked away in embarrassment. His hand was still on the man's chest, and he quickly pulled it away, feeling a rush of heat in his cheeks and along his ears. He knew he must be blushing. The spot where Tom's hand had been on the man's chest was a deep brown, the color of the mud he had covered himself with. It contrasted sharply with the pale skin surrounding it. The stranger stood in the middle of the ring of mushrooms. Tom stood just on the outside. The man, his eyes filled with desperation, looked at Tom. His mouth opened as if speaking, but no sound reached Tom's ears. He even reached out towards Tom, but some invisible force stopped him from reaching beyond the boundary of the mushrooms. Tom didn't know what he was thinking, or if he was thinking at all, but he reached out and took the man's hand and pulled it closer. It was difficult, like trying to pull a box under water. Suddenly, whatever had been resisting his efforts gave way, and he stumbled backwards, pulling the man with him. There was a sound of rushing air, as if a vacuum seal on a package of ground coffee beans had been broken, and air was rushing in. There were other noises too, sinister noises, dark noises. Tom had no time to notice them as he tried to catch his balance, but couldn't and fell backwards. The air rushed out of his lungs as he landed heavily on his back. His head cracked against the blade of the shovel where he had carelessly left it lying earlier, instead of putting it away. Pain filled his head, his vision blurred, and then everything went dark.